Bioethics Grand Rounds. It's noon, and I think it's time for us to begin. I'm Andrew Barnosky, and previously was the chair of our ethics committee, and now I'm still a member of the committee, but also a faculty member in the Path of Excellence in Bioethics. And it gives me really a lot of pleasure today to introduce Meredith Walton as our speaker. I've been at the University of Michigan for about 20 years, and during all of the time that our Bioethics Grand Rounds there, I think we've had 7 student speakers in that period of time. So it's always a very exciting presentation when we do have one of our students that gives this type of presentation. Meredith was in the first cohort of students in the Path of Excellence in Bioethics when it began during her first year in medical school. She's obviously now a 4th year student, and as part of that program, the students participate in developing a capstone project. Some of our students have chose to do a Bioethics Grand Rounds with Meredith has chosen to do, and we're looking forward to this presentation today. So Meredith's background, she is a graduate of Pomona College in Claremont, California, where she earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in classics. I met her shortly after the White Coat ceremony in her matriculation here, as I'm also a faculty in the Gross Anatomy program, and so have the occasion to meet of our students early in their education. Meredith was one of my mentees in the Path of Excellence in Bioethics, so I've worked with her during her 4 years here. And so her presentation is Opting In or Opting Out, the ethical principles underlying 2 methods of organ donation. Meredith, thank you very much for presenting to us today. So, all right.
Can you hear me? Hi, I'm Meredith Walton. As Dr. Barnosky said, I'm an M4 student here at the University of Michigan, and I'm here to discuss the ethical principles behind opt-out and opt-in systems of organ donation. And I have no conflicts to disclose. So I came to this topic in a kind of roundabout way. A good friend of mine in Ireland produced a documentary in 2013 called Perfect Match. And it chronicles the story of a famous Irish footballer and the stranger he decided to donate his kidney to. As they attempted to create an opt-out legislation in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland, which ultimately failed. And the documentary really got me thinking. Was it really ethical to have an opt-out system? What are the limits of autonomy and consent in this system? Because the needs are great. In 2012, there were more than 118,000 people on the waiting list in the United States, and only 8,143 underwent deceased donor transplant. So would opt-out be a viable option for increasing organ donation in the United States? So originally, when I was planning this presentation, I thought that opt-out and opt-in were a binary. So for definition, opt-out systems allowed organs to be donated unless the donor explicitly documented their refusal. So in the absence of documentation where they refused donation, the organs would be donated. In an opt-in system, which the United States have, organs are donated only when a donor gives their express consent for donation, such as they sign up for an organ donation registry. And then I woke up on New Year's Day to this. And I was a little confused when I saw this because as an M4, I've been going around and doing interviews for emergency medicine for residency, and I explicitly talked about France and how they had an opt-out system. And so when I woke up to this saying in 2017, they now have a new opt-out system, I thought, oh my God, I've lied in my residency interviews. Which is partially true, and I was panicking, so I went back to the literature. And this is a study done by Shepard et al., who looked at various systems of organ donation around the world, actually looked at 48 countries and classified them as opt-in or opt-out. And they went and looked, yep, it's there. France is opt-out. And here's the US, which is opt-in. And so I was really confused. What are these news sources talking about when they say France has a new opt-out system? And it turns out that opt-out and opt-in are more like a spectrum. So on the opt-in side, one side of this spectrum is the opt-in, where one can only donate if they signed up to donate. However, most opt-in countries like the United States are what I call, or what I've termed, familial consent, where the family can consent to donation for the donor, which includes the US. However, given no documentation of desire to donate, the organs won't be taken. On the other side of the spectrum is complete opt-out or hard opt-out, and is sometimes called routine salvaging, where the only way to stop a donation is by signing up to a registry or providing written documentation that the donor refuses to donate organs. Most opt-out countries are not the routine salvaged hard opt-out system. They're more of what I call presumed consent, and some people argue that opt-out and presumed consent are the same thing, but I think presumed consent is more where the default is to donate, but the family does have some say in the donation and are often consulted and give the final word on whether a donation will occur. And most European countries, such as France previously and Spain, which I'll come back to, have this model where they presume that the donor has consented, but ultimately the family has the final say. What happened in France is that they went from this model of the family has the final say to, unless the family has written documentation that the donor didn't want to donate, their organs are going to be donated. And the family has been taken out of the equation. So that's what all the kerfuffle was about in this media, in these media reports. So when I was explaining all of this to my friend in New York, who is also a medical student and has been learning about the 4 pillars of ethics, she went, wait, they're going to take organs without consent? Doesn't that like violate autonomy? And I said, well, it depends on how you define consent. And that brings me to the first argument on whether opt-out is a ethical option. So I take this from Ben Saunders, who wrote in the Journal of Medical Ethics and says there are several definitions that we need to have of consent. The first he makes is actual versus non-actual consent. Actual consent involves a deliberate, voluntary action, something that you can see, such as a patient signing an informed consent. You know what their consent is, they've made a deliberate action, and that is actual consent, versus non-actual consent, which is still consent. And that's more of what an ideal person might do in a situation without actually stating it. And this is most often brought up when a patient is rolled into the emergency room unconscious. We don't know what their particular views are, but we're going to do procedures that a reasonable person would want done, such as blood transfusions, procedures, intubation, you name it. Whatever a reasonable person would have done, that's non-actual consent, even though the person didn't actually give their express, deliberate consent. He further goes on to make the distinction between explicit and implicit consent. Explicit consent is, again, that express or active consent. We're actually making a choice, and it is an action. So again, the patient signs the informed consent document. That is an explicit action, that's explicit consent. Versus implicit, and that's more of a passive consent. So by not doing something, they're consenting. For example, if you agree to play a game of soccer, you're implicitly consenting to the rules of soccer. Or if you're a committee member and you don't object to a motion that's being passed, you're implicitly consenting to that motion. So how does this relate to opt-out and presumed consent? Saunders argues that presumed consent is actual implicit consent. The inaction of not signing up for the registry is a deliberate and voluntary inaction or action, even if it is tacit. However, Saunders recognizes that this comes with a caveat. People must know and understand that their silence will be interpreted as consent, and that an opt-out system isn't too costly and is able to be created, so that those who do object have a viable way of objecting. And Saunders argues that in this day and age, that is definitely feasible. Saunders goes on to further say that we have this idea of normative consent. And this is a little tricky, so bear with me. He says that even though presumed consent is an actual implicit consent, we don't actually need that actual consent. And so we have this hypothetical alternative that is normative consent. We can treat people as if they consented because any refusal they have is void. So, for example, let's say in college you had a roommate, and this roommate couldn't work if the radio was on. And so they said, under no circumstances are you to turn the radio on. You do not have my consent to turn the radio on. Now that is an unreasonable and morally wrong demand to make of you, to never turn the radio on. And since it is unreasonable, it doesn't have force, and therefore we can say that even though they have not consented, we can still turn the radio on. And this is normative consent. Because the refusal is void, we can act as if they consented, even if they haven't actually consented. And that's normative consent. So how does this apply to organ donation? Saunders starts with an assumption. It is wrong for people to withhold their consent to organ donation, which takes the moral power out of refusal. We can do a lot of good by donating our organs without placing an undue burden on the donor. The donor is already deceased or nearly deceased and don't need the organs anymore, and so any burden they would have is very small. And because of this, the benefit far outweighs the burden. We can increase the amount of organ donations without causing significant harm to the deceased, to the donor, making the refusal morally void. And because of this, because it is morally wrong not to donate, we do not need their actual consent. We can treat them as if they had consented. Now, there is one exception, Saunders says, to this, and that is religious belief. The threat of eternal damnation is a burden that far outweighs the benefit, and therefore we need an opt-out system in order to allow for this one time where refusal is not morally void. So that's all well and good, says my friend. Consent can be argued, but what about autonomy, our right to choose? And that brings me to my next point. This comes from Michael Gill at the University of Arizona. He splits the idea of autonomy into two models. The first is the idea of non-interference. It is wrong to interfere with a patient's body without permission. Pretty much the logic behind informed consent. If we're going to perform a procedure or do anything to another's body, we need to have their permission. He also says that there's another model, which is the respect for wishes. We must treat the body of a patient the way the patient wished it to be treated. Most of the time, when a person is competent and conscious, we are able to reconcile these two models. Typically, what the patient gives us permission to do is what they wished for. And so the two models align. We find what a person wants and perform the procedures with their permission. But what happens when a person isn't competent or is deceased? Gill says that the non-interference model no longer applies. We have to do something with their body. We can't just leave it there. And most people haven't explicitly stated what they want done with their body, whether it be cremated, buried, or haven't consented specifically to the procedures performed just before death that any reasonable person would want done. These are all interference. And because we must do something, we can't abide by the principle of non-interference. Therefore, we are left with respect for wishes. What would a reasonable person want done with their body? And how do we know what a reasonable person would want done with their body with respect to organ donation? We must go with the choice, therefore, that will create the fewest mistakes, whether to donate or not to donate. So what do most Americans want? Gill places his argument on a Gallup poll done in 1993, in which 70% of Americans wish to donate their organs after death. Forgive me if I don't trust Gallup polls anymore after the past election. So I went back to the literature and found this study by Volk et al., where he found that 70% wish to donate after cardiac death and 64% after brain death. So somewhere between 60 and 70% of patients wish to donate their organs after death. So if the majority of people want to donate their organs after death, and we must treat a patient's body in the way she wished it to be treated, the thing that would create the least mistakes would be to donate their organs. Most people want them donated. Most people wish to donate their organs. Therefore, we must donate. And that would create the fewest mistakes. However, this assumes that taking organs when they didn't want to donate is morally equivalent to not taking organs when they did want to donate. And those who are in favor of an opt-in system say that this isn't true, that they're not morally equivalent. Because if somebody who has a religious belief has their organs donated when they didn't want to, that is not congruent and is not morally equivalent to not taking organs when they did want to donate. So this is all. Both Gill and Saunders' arguments are based on the idea that opt-out systems work, that we're going to increase the amount of organs donated through this opt-out system. So, does opt-out actually work? And there have been a number of studies. This one was the largest and looked at 48 countries and specifically looked at kidney and liver, though they did do some on heart and lung, and looked at the difference between opt-in countries, such as the United States, versus opt-out, such as France and Spain. Did it truly, are there more organ donations in opt-out countries? And so if you look here, they looked at deceased donors, and this is specifically for liver and kidneys, that the opt-in consent rate went from 9.98 per million population to 14.24 of deceased donations, and that was a significant difference. So it would seem that increasing, or that opt-out would increase the amount of donors. However, an interesting thing that they found was that living donors actually decreased from 9.36 to 5.49 in opt-out countries. So even with that decrease, there was still an overall increase in donation in opt-out countries, according to this study. Now, the first part of that was including Spain in the calculation, and the second part, they took out Spain. Spain has the highest rate of organ donation in the world, and even when they took out Spain, there still was a significant increase in organ donation from opt-in to opt-out countries. And living donors still had a significant decrease when you went from opt-in to opt-out countries. Now, Shepard recognizes that there are factors that might they tried to control for factors that like GDP, traffic accidents, hospital beds, Catholicism, which tends to correlate with an opt-out system, surprisingly, and civil versus common law, which might confound these observations, but they recognize that comparing these two systems, further confounders might be cultural differences and things like that, so they were kind of wishy-washy on whether this data was actually applicable. Other studies I found looking just within a country when they went from opt-in to opt-out. An example, Austria went from 4.6 per million population to 27.2 in 5 years. Belgium's kidney donation went from 10.9 to 41.3 in just 3 years. However, Chile experienced a 29% decrease in organ donation after implementation of opt-out. So the question is, does opt-out work? Maybe. It's not really clear. There's good evidence that it does work. However, there's a lot of studies out there that say that it decreases in some countries, actually. So I think that the jury is still out and studies need to be done more on this. Which brings me to a case that the proponents of opt-in often bring up, which is Spain. So Spain has the highest organ donation rate in the world, 36 per million population. And that, they have had presumed consent since 1979, but in 1979, when they enacted the presumed consent, their donation rates were mostly stagnant. They didn't go up or down even after opt-out was enacted. The donation rates in Spain didn't actually go up until they formed the National Transplant Organization, ONT, in 1989. What the ONT did is that it created designated organ donation coordinators, physicians that coordinated organ donations, as well as a network that was central, regional, and local, close relationships with the media, a good public relations campaign, formation of educational programs, basically boosting the infrastructure of the transplant organization in Spain. And after that, the proportion of retrieval went from 30% in 1989 to 80% today, 10 years after the implementation of presumed consent. So people that are for opt-in say, well, it wasn't actually the presumed consent that raised the organ donations in Spain. It was the formation of good infrastructure, a good transplant coordinating organization that caused the increase. And that Spain isn't actually really presumed consent. A lot of people in the ONT say, really, we have presumed consent because we always consult the family, and they always have final say, and we won't just take organs without somebody consenting to it. So is Spain really presumed consent? That's a big question. And a lot of people say that they aren't actually presumed consent, so we shouldn't include them in the countries that have opt-out. So I've mentioned a lot of arguments against opt-out and for opt-in. And so what are some of the specific arguments that come up in the literature? first, revisiting Saunders and normative consent, his argument is based on the benefits outweighing the burden. It's really unclear to me and to a lot of people whether enacting an opt-out system will actually increase the amount of organs available for transplant. It seems in the case of Spain that actually having a better infrastructure is how to increase the supply of organs, whether or not a presumed consent legislation is intact. And then secondly, the first part of Saunders' argument necessitates that patients understand that their silence means consent, which is incredibly hard to accomplish, especially in the US. And if we look at the Europeans, there was a study done called the Eurobarometer, where only 28% of Europeans know the regulation of their country governing the donation and transplantation of organs. So only 28% of those in opt-out countries actually know that their system is opt-out and that they need to sign up for a registry to prevent donation of organs. And I can't even imagine what that rate would be like in the United States. So, can we really say that people would understand that not signing up for this registry is a tacit consent? And I'm not so sure that we can do that. Secondly, looking at his normative consent argument, Potts argued that normative consent verges on totalitarianism, that the government is telling its citizens what is morally right or wrong. That we can't just take away that the determination made by the individual about what is morally right or wrong. It's different for everybody, and in a democratic society like the United States, telling people what is morally right or wrong is unconstitutional. And then finally, bringing it back to Gill's argument, basically the idea that we are seeking consent based on the wishes of the patient. Gill's argument is based on the idea that we are only seeking consent when the person is not competent or incapacitated. Douglas McKay, in response, says that there is a real possibility that citizens will have to make this determination, that car accidents happen all the time, medical mishaps happen all the time, and the idea that we will have to donate is a very real possibility. And because it is a real possibility, and the decision matters to people, not just the patient, but also the survivors of the patient, family members, that we should ask before the patient becomes incompetent and is not able to decide for themselves. And we can do that because it is not costly to create an opt-in system like we already have, and that it would be just as costly to create an opt-out system. So why not do what we are able to do, which is obtain consent before the person becomes incompetent. And he further argues that Spain's presumed consent legislation did not do as much to increase donation rates as creating the ONT. And so a possible alternative to opt out would be to boosting our infrastructure for organ donation. So finally, that brings me to my conclusion. Is opt-out feasible in the US? And the Department of Health and Human Services did a survey based on attitudes towards organ donation in the US, and this comes from 2012. And roughly half of those surveyed oppose or strongly oppose presumed consent legislation. And so largely the American population is against or divided on presumed consent. And he points out that the US already has the fourth highest donation rate, fourth only to Spain, Croatia, and Portugal at 26 donations per million population. And so when I looked at this, I was wondering, well, what objections do people have to opt out in presumed consent? And so the top reasons from this survey from Health and Human Services looked at Americans' attitudes towards this. And the top reasons given, it should be an individual's decision or freedom of choice. It's a violation of your rights, and belief that presumed consent is unethical. Basically, that presumed consent does not jive with autonomy, consent, and ethics. So here are my, here's my bibliography, and I want to thank Dr. Barnowski for his advice, Dr. Verkler and Dr. Schumann for giving me this opportunity, and my family for being so supportive. And so I'll leave it open to questions, comments, and concerns. This is a photo from transplant camp, Camp Nishitanki for kids based at North Star Reach. And so this little girl has received a liver transplant. So thank you very much for your time. Yes.
You had a slide fairly early on and said after somebody was dead, on the left side it was X'd out about, they wanted to interfere with the patient's body. Except I think most countries still say it is wrong to desecrate a corpse just because of some moral feelings. I mean, you can't, if you cross that out, then we can start thinking about grave diggers and stealing bodies for autopsy, which, medical schools need. So it might be a little more nuanced than just this.
Yeah, and that's one of the major complaints for Gill's argument is that, that leaves us free to do a lot of things to a body that we wouldn't otherwise be able to. And so it's really not as simple as saying, like, we can't interfere.
Yeah, and at least, your argument about Spain is interesting because that's really what UNOS is trying to do in the United States. We have a coordinator here, who talks to patients, and as my father always used to say, if you don't ask, you don't get. So that seems to be something that increases the willingness to donate in the absence of either a specific applicant or an applicant.
Yeah, and that's my argument that it really doesn't. I think the jury's still out on whether opt out or opt in is the better system, but really it seems to be having better organization tends to increase organ donation regardless of the type of system that you have. Yeah.
Along the lines of the organization, what do you think the medical community can do to develop a better ONT as Spain has it? Do you think physicians, primary care physicians, should ask the question in a routine exam?
That's a loaded question. So that would, I think introducing, so the way Spain does it is that they have physicians that are specifically there to talk about organ donation, and that's their entire job is organ donation. Whether or not a PCP should be asking consistently, I'm really not sure whether or not that would increase organ donation rates. I say it can't hurt.
I guess my point is, what did Spain do? You also put on that slide that there was a public education campaign too.
Yeah.
That in society it kind of made it normative. And in America, we don't make it normative.
Yeah.
We don't talk about it.
Yeah.
How can we talk about it?
So they did a lot of educational campaigns going into schools and talking about it even early on, talking about organ donation, a lot of PSAs, and then making it widely known in the newspaper, organ donation is important, you should really look into this, you should really make a decision about this. And then specifically when the donor would come in and they were looking for that patient to donate, having that coordinator in the hospital to coordinate that at the moment that they were going to donate was something that they also improved upon. So it was locally that they did it, but also regionally throughout the country. So I think focusing on public relations campaigns, but also having that coordination within the hospital was what increased their donation rate. Does that answer your question? Yes.
So Meredith, on behalf of the Path of Excellence in Bioethics and the entire medical ethics community here at the University of Michigan, thank you.
I went a bit faster than I had been practicing.
Oh, that's okay. It was good. It was good, yeah.